All right, recording is on. So everyone on the call, you are now being recorded. Welcome to SQL Friday. This is, I think it's number 95, if I'm not totally wrong. So we're close to SQL Friday 100, but still 5 to go. Today we have Eitan Blumin, who is coming back to us. Eitan is going to talk about contained availability groups in SQL 2022.
Yes.
Which is yet to be released as an RTM. So hopefully all the things you mentioned today will make it to the RTM. We will see, I guess.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, hopefully not all of it, but we'll talk about it in the slides.
Okay. No, that's true. It's a kind of, many of the things that you're going to mention today are new, and we all know that new software doesn't actually work. So.
Well, it works as expected, but it does have its limitations.
Okay. Anyway, welcome to SQL Friday, or welcome back to SQL Friday. I'm going to leave everything else to you, except if people have questions, put them in the chat, and I will interrupt Eitan as we go along.
Sure thing. Okay. So thank you for joining me in the session. As Magnus said, we are talking about SQL Server 2022, specifically the feature called Contained Availability Groups. So before we dive in, a few words about myself. My name is Eitan Blumin. I'm a team leader in Madeira Data Solutions and a senior SQL Server DBA. I have, you can find me on LinkedIn. I have my own blog. You can also find some content I make on the official Madeira Data Solutions website. I also co-host the SQL Server Radio podcast together with Guy Glanzer, who is the CEO of Madeira Data Solutions. A few words, just a bit about Madeira Data Solutions. We are the leading consulting company in Israel for the Microsoft Data Platform in general and SQL Server specifically. We also lead our local data platform meetup, as we call it. It's essentially what was previously known as the local user group. So we also lead that. Okay, and we're also a Microsoft Gold partner, and I think I'll move on from here. Okay, so first of all, as Magnus said, everything in this session is relevant to SQL Server, which is currently, it's in release candidate stage, RC. What you see here may not necessarily, most likely will, but may not necessarily be relevant for when SQL Server 2022 becomes GA or RTM. And it may change somewhat in future versions after SQL Server 2022. So take that into considerations. Before we talk about SQL Server 2022, let's see what we had before that. So assuming that we had two instances of SQL Server, and we've set up an availability group between them, which could include one or more databases that could fail over between each instance, and they would be rapidly synchronized, continuously synchronized between them. And that would be like a very good solution for synchronizing these databases at a database level. But what about objects which exist outside of these databases? Objects such as server logins or scheduled jobs, and we have also permissions of server logins, linked servers, and essentially anything that is stored in system databases such as MSDB and master. So before SQL Server 2022, we would have to implement our own solution for this. Although, frankly speaking, most shops that I see don't do anything. They just rely on having a single main primary replica, which would have all the objects, and they wouldn't bother even to synchronize server level objects on the secondary replicas, which would expectedly cause all kinds of problems the moment when a failover has to happen, and then half of your things don't work. Custom solutions could be implemented to add some kind of synchronization between them. One of these specifically meant for synchronizing jobs, or rather not synchronizing, but failing over the jobs, is a solution developed by yours truly at Madera Data Solutions, which I called in short, Header My Jobs. I believe I also delivered the sessions here on SQL Friday on this topic. I think it was one of my even first sessions here, right?
It could be. I'm not sure, to be honest.
I think so. I think it was my first session on SQL Friday. Anyways, you can go ahead and visit this link, and if you have an availability group with jobs that you want to be able to fail over automatically together with the database, then that's an excellent solution. It works great. It's very customizable and flexible. You can do all kinds of cool stuff with it. So with that blog out of the way, let's move into SQL Server 2022, where we have container availability groups. And what that means is that, as I said, these server level objects, they're actually stored in MSDB and master. So question being asked is, why not take this MSDB and master and shove it into the availability group? Make it part of the availability group so that those system databases will also be synchronized as part of the availability group. Obviously, we can't just do that with the actual system databases, but what we can do, what SQL Server 2022 does, is create a new pair of master and MSDB databases, which serve as de facto system databases within the availability groups. These are basically the system databases contained within the availability group. So if, for example, we have an availability group called, let's say, myAG1, then these databases will be created as myAG1 underscore master and MSDB. And as I said, they will be part of the availability group, and they will be synchronized, and they'll be failed over together with the availability group. Once we have that, a few interesting things happen. So on the left hand side of the screen, you can see what we would see when we connect regularly, normally, to a non-contained availability group database. Like, you just connect basically to the regular normal instance, okay? And you see here the availability group contained system databases. And you see the databases which are synchronized as part of the availability groups, and those that aren't, and you see the server level objects, or you don't see them. But if you connect to the listener of the container availability group, or directly into one of the databases which belongs to this availability group, then you would see a different picture. And it would look like this on the right-hand side. You will see only the databases, the database or databases, which belong to this specific availability group. And the server level objects that you would see are the server level objects which are actually created in the contained system databases. So as you can see, this is actually the exact same instance physically. But I see here a linked server that I don't see here, and I see a job that I don't see here, and this job that was created at the instance level does not exist at the availability group level, and I see an alert and an operator and all kinds of stuff can be visible and accessible here. And you may also notice that we see master, MSDB, and TempDB here, while with master and MSDB being these master and MSDB. Okay, it's not the actual master and MSDB of the overall instance, and we don't see the model databases. It's not part of this this game of availability grouping. So essentially, what happens is that in a way we've entered some sort of virtual reality inside of our SQL server. And this basically contained availability group is sort of like this virtual reality. It's a reality inside of a reality, philosophically speaking.
Can I ask you a question about it? I saw TempDB was also there. Is that still the one and only TempDB, or will the contained availability group get its own?
No, it doesn't contain. It doesn't get its own. That is the TempDB of the normal instance.
Yeah. Okay, too bad. I would have wanted one per availability group. That would have
Why?
Because it's a way to get away from TempDB contention. For what?
Ah, you're a clever boy. Okay, I see what you're doing. Okay. Well, SQL Server is not there yet in creating multiple TempDB databases. But yeah, I see what you're going with. Yeah.
I think DB2 and Oracle has it. It's like one TempDB per database or something. Which anyway,
I think there's a open feedback item on this, on creating user database level TempDBs in SQL Server, but no expectations yet for it to be implemented anytime soon.
They did with the in SQL 2019 with the I don't remember the name.
Recovery, something about the recovery, rapid recovery, something.
Yeah, exactly. Then you get, I mean, it's not the TempDB on its own, but the row store is stored inside the user database. So it's a step forward, at least, I think.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but that's a different topic. Let's get back to the one at hand. So, okay, so we have this new feature of container availability groups. And with it, there would also be changes to how we create availability group and work with availability groups. So, for example, there's a preview version of SQL Server Management Studio version 19. The one which is currently in GA is 18. There will be version 19. I expect that it will become GA when SQL Server 2022 becomes GA. But for now, you can download its preview version, and in it, and as of now, only in it, in the new availability group wizard, or even not the wizard, but even the regular screen, you can see a new option for creating your availability group as a contained availability group with this new checkbox here. So there's also, if you enable it, you can optionally also enable this additional checkbox called reuse system databases. What this means is, let me go back a bit. If, for example, you're creating an availability group called, let's say, AG2, okay? And there is already existing databases called AG2 master and MSDB, for example, like this couple here. Then it will detect, if you enable that checkbox, it will detect that these databases already exist, and it will simply reuse them instead of creating new ones from scratch. So that can be very useful. In a moment, I'll say why. But that's just so you know the meaning of this checkbox. Similarly, there's also a new syntax in the create availability group command in T-SQL. Same thing, you can add the contained and optionally reuse system databases options in when you create a new availability group. And there are also a couple of changes in system DMVs. So there's a change in sysdm exec sessions. There's a new column called contained availability group ID, which holds the group ID of the availability group if the session in question connected into this, what I call the virtual reality, right? So when this session, from its point of view, it's seeing the contained system databases. So when it's in this state, it sees, you would see in its corresponding record in DMExec sessions, you'll see the ID. Okay. And in sys availability groups, you would also have a new column called is contained, which is it says what it is. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So using this pair of new information, you can tell per each session, including for your own, whether it is currently seeing the contained availability group or not. What does contained availability group support in terms of interoperability? What can it work together with? It does support. It supports CDC. It supports log shipping, but only for the primary database in the log shipping session, and it supports TD, transparent data encryption. But important to note, first of all, why are these animals here? Why are these animals special? Because in order to create CDC and log shipping and TD, you have to do something at the server level. In case of CDC and log shipping, you need to create jobs. There will be jobs created behind the scenes that would manage this thing. In terms of TDE, there needs to be a certificate that's created in the master database for this to work. So you can do these things, assuming that when you create and configure these things, you do this while being connected to the container availability group virtual reality, essentially. So if you do that, and these necessary objects are created inside the contained system databases, then it should work. What does not work is, as of today, replication. All types of SQL Server replication do not work together with container availability groups. You cannot, have a contained database, which is also the secondary database in the log shipping session. And it does not support distributed availability groups. This is true as of today, as of release candidate of SQL Server 2022. Perhaps it will change sometime in the future. I hope it does. But for now, that's what we have. Let's talk a bit now about what happens when at that moment when a new contained availability group is created, a new pair of contained system databases are created. So the first thing that happens after these are created is that all sysadmin logins, and only the sysadmin logins, are copied over from the instance level master system database to the contained master database. And only the sysadmin logins. The reason for this is that because these sysadmin, they just need one server role, and by doing that, it allows whichever sysadmin that just created this availability group, they now have access to this container availability group. And this, I mean, in terms of principally all sysadmin logins, they're supposed to have access to everything. So I mean, it makes sense. What about other logins? Well, you're going to have to do it yourself. Essentially, you're going to have to copy all the server level objects, not just the logins, but all server level objects that are relevant to the contained availability group databases. You would have to recreate those, copy them manually into the contained availability group. And now I'm going to ask, how does login authentication work when container availability groups are involved? This is an interesting question because, okay, if I need to copy several logins, and now I have a situation where perhaps I have several login which exists inside the container availability group and one that but doesn't exist outside it, and vice versa. Maybe I have a login that exists outside the container availability group but not inside it. These are interesting questions. Which one will have access? Which one will not have access? So to answer that question, I'll explain it like this. The authentication point is the same point where you perform your connection. Okay, so the connection point that you're using in SQL Server is the authentication point. What I mean by that? So for example, if you're logged into the listener of the availability group, that means that the connection point is the container availability group. And that means that the container availability group will also be the authentication point. In other words, it will look for the login that you tried inside the contained availability group. And if it doesn't exist there, the login will fail. If you connected to the normal instance, the external instance, then that will be your authentication point. And if your login doesn't exist there, then it will fail. Now, once you are logged in, you have in your hand, let's say, you have an SID. And the SID is basically a unique identifier for your login. Okay? And this unique identifier is what's used when configuring all kinds of permission and access and role memberships and so on. So if your SID, for example, exists as a database user and it has permissions, then those are the permissions that you will get. And if your SID is a member of a role, then this role permissions is what you're going to get. Why am I saying this? Let's say, I'll say it like this. First of all, I'll show you the next slide. But before that, just I forgot to mention something. To make it easier to copy over logins, existing logins, for example, let's say you have existing logins in the external instance and you want to copy them to the container availability group. It's not a trivial thing to do because you need to maintain that same SID, right? Otherwise, you have orphaned users and you may lose permissions and so on. So to make it easier for you, there's a store procedure created by, I think it was Kenneth Fisher. We have a copy of it, a variation of it inside our GitHub repository called Madera Toolbox. You can go ahead and get it. It's obviously it's free, and what it does is it generates creation scripts and basically scripts that you would need to recreate a certain login elsewhere. That includes several level permissions, role memberships, and so on. And it creates the login with the same original SID. So it's very easy to use. Strongly recommend that. Okay, so something more that I need to talk about. Let's say it like this. Go. Okay. I'll reiterate this point. The connection point, as I said, is the authentication point, but it does not define the scope of access, as in, if you connect into the availability group, if you're entering this virtual reality, it does not necessarily mean that you are locked you're locked inside this virtual reality. You can actually go outside it if your SID has permissions. For example, let's say that you have a Windows authentication login. And as you should know, Windows authentication logins are created with a specific SID that it receives from the operating system, from Windows, either from the domain or the local user account, doesn't matter. It's an SID which is consistent. So if you create the same login in the external instance and also inside the availability group, they would necessarily have the same SID. So if this login has permissions to the contained availability group databases and also to other databases outside of the availability group, that means that even if that user connects into the virtual reality of the contained availability group, they will still have access to the external database, which is outside of the availability group. And that's a bit of an odd behavior, but it makes sense in a way. I'll talk about the rest a bit. You know what? I'm going to show you a demo about this next part. Here we go. Okay. So I have here before me an instance that I prepared in advance. With a contained availability group, there is one contained availability group here called AG. It has a couple of replicas and these cute little databases, including, as I said, the system databases AG Master and MSDB. Right now, I'm connected to the external instance. So that means that I see these AG Master and AG MSDB, and I also see external databases, which are, databases which are outside of the availability group. Okay. So let's say that I connect like this. I open a new query to this external database, and I query from these databases. Let me make this a bit bigger. Okay. So I see basically all of the databases in the instance, right? Let's see what happens if I connect directly into one of the availability group databases. Oh, suddenly I see a different picture. Because as I said, I connected directly into one of the databases inside the container availability group, I see a different set of databases because this thing, this DMV called sys databases, comes from here, from the contained master system database. So it contains a different list of databases, understandably. But as you can see, I have access to this here database in external called external DB, right? Let's see, I have tables here. Yeah, I have a table 1, okay? Table 1. So my current user is a Windows account user. It has access to table 1. And here, let's do like this. Obviously, this would not work because I am, okay, this is a different table because I'm in DemoDB. Damn it, I made a fool of myself because I named them the same thing. Okay, so let's make things a bit interesting. Let's rename this table just to convince you of what I'm talking about. Okay. So this is inside DemoDB, and this would be external table. Okay, so that we'll see the difference. Okay, so this obviously wouldn't work because obviously I'm not in the same database. But what if I do this? External db.dbo.table external. This does work, even though external DB doesn't show up here at all in the list. Okay. Yeah, so that connects to what I said earlier about the SIDs, because I currently have a specific SID. Let's say you can actually check your own SID using this thing as user SID. This is my SID, and if I select the same thing here, I will get the same value. Okay. So this is what determines what you will have access to and what you will have permissions to do based on this SID. If you create a different login, make it interesting. Okay. Let's say we create a login. This is in the external instance, right? Let's say I call it test1, and it's a SQL Server login. Okay, it has, let's say, I'll put in something simple like 1234, 1234 as the password. Okay, and let's say it has access to external DB as a reader. Okay, something very simple. Okay, now I can connect to SQL 2022A as test1 1234, and it will work, obviously. But if I connect to the listener with the same login, then it will not work, because the point of connection, as I said, is the point of authentication. So it doesn't recognize it because this user doesn't exist in the contains master database. That's interesting. But what if I connect to this listener thing, and now I'm inside the virtual reality, and now I create a new login with the same name, test1, but let's make it interesting. Let's put in a different password. Let's say 123. And it will have access to DemoDB. Cool. So now I try to connect to the AG listener using test1. If I put in the password from the previous one, 1234, the external login, doesn't work. If I put in 123, then it does work. And then I will have access. So now I'm connected as test1, and I do have test1 in the external instance. So one would say, okay, well, test1 has been given access to external DB. So what happens if I do this? Nothing, because it's not the same login. As I said, the SID is what matters, because I created two different logins, SQL authentication logins, and I didn't specify an explicit SID for them. Using T-SQL, you can do that, but from the graphical interface, you can't. So a different SID was created for them. Let's do this thing. See, I have one SID here, and if I connect to, not this one, the main instance as 124. Yeah. No, not this one, this. And that's a different SID. Okay, so that's why the authentication fails. Okay, so that was a lot of interesting stuff, specifically about authentication and permissions.
I have a question. You said that.
Okay. Yeah. One more thing which I wanted to say. Let's say I'm connected as a test1. That's not what I need. Let's connect using the big one, the big login. Okay. So as I said, for example, currently I'm connected to, this is the regular instance, the external one, okay? And the master database in question, which is being, no, sorry, I'm in DemoDB, so it's the contained database. And the master database in question is the one which is contained, the AG, what is AG master, okay? This is where I'm actually querying from. Similarly, if I query from MSDB sys jobs, I will be querying from, this is test1, this is the listener. This is a contained job. This is a job that I created in the contained availability group. So if I query from msdb .sys jobs, this is what I would see when I'm connected to the virtual reality, okay? If I am outside and I do the same thing, I would see the jobs that were created at the instance level, the external instance. But if I am at the external instance, I do have AG MSDB. And that's kind of weird. Okay, it's a kind of a weird creature here. But I do have access from the external database, external instance. I do have access to these system databases, which would behave essentially as normal user databases. One more thing important to note is, check this out. Let's say DB-ID of master and DB-ID of MSDB. Now I am in the external database. Okay, this is where I am now. And normally, before SQL Server 2022, these are the IDs that we would expect. Master is always ID 1, MSDB is always ID 4. But if I do the same query from inside the virtual reality, oh, that's a bit weird. Very weird creature, as I said. Master is ID 1, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. But MSDB is not ID 4. Okay. So MSDB specifically is this bizarre hybrid creature, which on the one hand behaves as a system database, and on the other hand, it doesn't have the ID of a system database, which is very weird. So why am I saying this? Because there are all kinds of scripts, of T-SQL scripts. It's very common to see that, let's say they reiterate, they iterate across all databases, and they would have something like this, where database ID larger than 4. Yeah. This is very common to see in all kinds of maintenance scripts and cross database operation scripts that would want to basically do something on all user databases only. And if you do that by relying on the database ID, then this body is going to capture MSDB as well when you do this from inside the content availability group.
Wow, that's a big thing.
It's a very weird being, this content availability group.
We have some questions in
Okay, so let's see, what did I miss? When connecting to availability groups, you want to see database in the content availability plus TempDB. Yes, I said that. Content master will be, that I said, yeah, okay. Database ID, that's what I just said. Master retains its one ID. MSDB does not. While users will not see databases outside of the content availability group in SIS databases when connected in the content, they will be able to access those databases by 4-part names or through the use command based on SID. As I said, yeah, the use command also works for this thing. So let's say, again, I do not see here the external database, external DB, but I can do this. By the way, here you also can see it, okay, because it's queries from the same thing from SIS database, but I suddenly can do this. And I am in external DB, but it's not in the list, and it's very weird and bizarre behavior, but it is possible. Okay, server configurations can be read from within the content availability group connection, but they can only be written or changed from the instance level. So, for example, if you make changes at the instance level, like all kinds of configurations, settings and stuff, all of the things here, okay, you can see them when you're connected to the contained availability group. You can see them. but it wouldn't work to change them. For example, I don't know, cost threshold. Why? I don't know, because. Then it will fail. Changes to server configuration options are not permitted in the connection to container availability group. Change connection to SQL Server instance level and retry the operation. Okay. So if you need to do some kind of maintenance or change some settings at the instance level, or even at the availability group level, you can only do this when connected to the external instance. But, and this is important to note, there are operations that sysadmins can do from inside the container availability group, such as shutting down SQL Server. If you run the shutdown command, that is possible to do. Just an example. And I already said this part. Okay.
We have some questions.
Now, next, I want to focus a bit about jobs. So as I said, we have the MSDB, and it synchronizes automatically. The contain MSDB synchronizes automatically as part of the availability group. It fails over automatically as part of the availability group. So that means that jobs that you configured, you created inside the content availability group, they execute only on the primary replica. And that's basically what this feature called content availability group gives us in terms of jobs. What else, you ask? Nothing, that's it. Even if you have a readable secondary and you want to run some kind of job, let's say it's a read-only job, it does something and then sends an email or whatever, you still can only run this on the primary replica only. Now, I want to show this. As I said, I have an availability group here, right? And currently this is the primary, but let's say I want to connect to the secondary. But not just this one. I want to connect to DemoDB. Okay. Now what I'm seeing is I'm inside the virtual reality of the availability group, but on the secondary replica. And I would see here the job, the contained jobs, okay? But I cannot run this job because it will tell me that you cannot start the job because this is a secondary replica of contained availability group, and you have to start the job at the primary replica of this contained availability group. Even though you can see the jobs here and you can see the databases and they are readable, it doesn't help, okay? The reason for this, that we have this limitation, is because on the secondary replica, MSDB is read-only. It's readable, but it's not writable. And when a job is executed, it does all kinds of things, which are not only readable things. It has to change the status of the job. It has to insert a record into the job history of MSDB. And that means that MSDB has to be writable. So as I said, that's what will happen if you try to run this on the secondary replica, it won't let you. So if there are use cases where you do want to run a job on the secondary replica specifically, and let's say only on the secondary replica, maybe there are use cases like that, it's possible, then container availability groups would not give you these solutions. You would have to do something else. For example, what I mentioned earlier about the solution developed by yours truly called Header My Jobs, it does have that kind of flexibility where you can tell it on which replica, whether it's primary or secondary, you want to run a specific job or a set of jobs. So yay, I'm still relevant. Okay, so let's summarize. Let's talk about what container availability groups does not do. It does not allow contained jobs to run on secondary replicas, as I just said. It does not automatically synchronize instance levels objects to contained AG level objects and vice versa. For example, if you create, after the availability group already exists and you create a new login, even if it's a sysadmin login, it will not be automatically copied over into the contained availability group. You will have to do that manually and vice versa. It does not synchronize server level objects across multiple contained availability groups. Again, let's say, for example, you create a job or you create a login, a sysadmin login inside the contained availability group. It will not copy it anywhere. It will not copy it to the external instance. It will not copy it to a different availability group maybe that you have. All of these server level object maintenance and creation modification, it has to be contained and individual per whether it's for the external instance or for a contained availability group. And also, contained availability group does not provide you a solution for objects outside of SQL Server, which is, I don't know, it's pretty much understandable. Although there are use cases where people would want a solution for this, because there is something inside SQL Server that has dependency maybe on outside resources, such as a service or an application or files in the file server in folders or whatever, environment variables, firewall rules, all of these things that are created and maintained at the operating system level. There is no solution inside SQL Server of synchronizing or failing them over. So let's talk about the alternatives that we have. So as I said about the jobs, my solution is still relevant. You can go ahead and use it. Header My Jobs, it's an open source solution, very simple to set up. There's even a webinar that I delivered here in SQL Friday that explains, goes into detail about it. You can also use DBA tools, which have famously known PowerShell module of very, very useful commandlets, including commandlets that copy and synchronize server level objects between instances. So you could use that to synchronize server level objects between the external instance and, let's say, the listener or the contained availability group as, as different connections. And if you have operating system level resources that you would want to fail over or maintain, then it's preferable to separate those. There are solutions for this, which are outside of our current expertise as DBAs, but there are solutions for these things. You can do a file server, you can do a web server, whatever server. You can do those things if assuming that you separate them to a different server from SQL Server. And so it is possible, it's just not a SQL Server issue. And that also includes policy management at the Windows or domain level that will be relevant for stuff like firewall rules, for example, or permissions at the operating system level. But again, these are things outside of our expertise as DBAs. It's not our job to do this thing. Now, before we go towards the end of this session, let's talk a bit about other availability-related improvements in SQL Server 2022. So first of all, there's something called Link to Azure SQL Managed Instance, which is a very special feature that allows you to connect a local, like an on-prem or IaaS SQL Server instance to an Azure SQL managed instance. It's very similar to an availability group, essentially. It's very useful for disaster recovery or some kind of online migration. It's a new feature. It's specific to SQL Server 2022 as of today. Okay. You can also, there are also improvements to distributed availability groups. There's a new option called required synchronized secondaries to commit, which means basically what is the minimum number of secondaries secondary replicas that need to commit in order for a synchronized availability group to to basically acknowledge that a transaction was committed. And this was not available until today in distributed availability groups, but starting with SQL Server 2022, it is possible. There's also a list of a few features here, including multiple TCP connections, parallel redo, thread pool, parallel redo, batch redo. All of these features, they are meant to improve the performance of availability groups for faster synchronizations, faster recovery operations, and so on. There's also an improvement in MSDB DBO backup set system table. There's also a new column that returns the last valid restore time for a backup. That could be very useful for if you have periodical backup tests, backup restore tests, and so on. And there are also improvements related to query store, where you can now control the query store behavior on secondary replicas. You can have, for example, a separate query store, which is maintained per replica. And that includes also operations related to query store, such as forcing a plan, for example. And that's about it. Are there any questions?
There are some questions. Do you hear me, Eitan?
You're muted.
No.
No? I'm
Sure.
muted? Maybe I am. Maybe I am muting you. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, you're right. Oh no, the headphones turned off on their own because they timed out because you were so quiet.
All right. That explains why I couldn't ask you some questions. But let's take them
now.
now.
They were. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
It's the headphones that turned off on their own. Sorry.
So we have, let's see, is there any way to know for a connection if it's connected to the listener of a contained availability group or if it's connected to the instance?
Yes, of course. I mentioned it earlier. Right at the start where it is. There you go. This one. Yeah, you can.
Of course, you can look at your own session. True.
Exactly. You can query from sys dmexec sessions where session ID equals your session, which for those of you who don't know, let's demonstrate this. Let's say sys dmexec sessions where session ID equals this thing, speed. I am speed. And this is your session. This is you. And in here, you would have the new column called container availability group ID. This is the external one. No, I think it's the contained one. Contained inside external. Weird. And in here, see, this is null.
Yep.
Okay, so that's the way to tell if your current connection is a contained connection. Let's call it that way.
Yep. Then we have, let's see, one was from Andre. Can we query content of the contained master without connecting to the listener? And I think you showed that it's possible. I mean, it's just a user database.
Exactly.
For external instance, it's just the database.
Exactly.
Is there an easy way to move or copy other system objects except of logins?
Yeah, as I mentioned, DBA tools, which is an excellent set of tools for all kinds of purposes, but it also includes copying server-level objects. All server-level objects are supported in DBA tools, so yeah, go wild.
On the other hand, I mean, some of the server-level tools or objects, I mean, are not they're not relevant to the container availability group, like an endpoint, for example. The endpoint is just going to exist on the actual server. There is no way to have an endpoint inside a contained availability group because it wouldn't make sense, basically. So.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's see. What about the contained database inside the contained availability groups? Now we're going wild here.
I didn't see anything about it in the documentation, and I didn't have a chance to play around with it. I personally don't like contained databases. It's a different kind of animal. So I don't have an answer for that. Sorry.
Yeah. Then there is this, can you create stuff like indexes and indexed views on a DB within a contained AG on the secondary? And I guess the answer is going to be no, because the second is read-only. So.
Yeah, the secondary is at most it's read-only. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a lot of money, it's read-only. Otherwise, it's going to be not even read-only.
Yeah, if you have expensive edition, yeah.
Yeah. I have one question, which is, I was thinking to myself, we have some applications that require the application's login to be sysadmin, which I think is a ridiculous requirement, but it's what it is from a third-party system. So I was thinking about putting that into a contained availability group with just one node, just to be able to isolate that sysadmin. So I have just the database for that application, and it's just a way to avoid creating another instance, basically.
Sounds like you're being lazy, to be honest.
Yeah, but it's you know, the more instances you have, the more possibilities for. I mean, you need to have backup jobs for all of them, and it's going to be more maintenance if you have more instances. So.
Well, that's a good question because of the specific use case of backups, right? So specifically in terms of backup, that's something that I would consider the type of job that you would create on the external instance.
Yeah, and that's
we have the Ola Hallengren maintenance jobs that automatically detect whether a database is the primary or secondary, and it also takes into consideration the what's it called, the backup preference.
Yeah,
whether a replica is the preferred backup replica. It takes all of that into consideration, and it's an excellent solution from Ola Hallengren. And I don't think there's a reason to create that inside the contained availability group. It already is so robust and flexible that I just don't see a need to make it contained.
No,
that's specifically for backups. I guess you could think about maybe other use cases.
No, and it's more like if I just don't want to add instances, basically. I have a client where they use failover cluster instance as the disaster recovery, and that's what they do, basically. There is an operations provider who they don't really support out of the box having availability groups. So it's failover cluster instance, and if I'm going to add an instance to a cluster just for one database for a system, well, that means a lot of administration because you need to create another role in the cluster and so on. So I was more thinking maybe I should do a contained availability group with just one node and just add that login to that contained availability.
I'm not sure I follow. I'm not sure I understand the use case.
I want to be able to isolate like one application that requires sysadmin for its system to work, basically.
Oh, it's like a prerequisite for the application. If you don't have sysadmin, it screams at you.
Yeah. So, or even if it doesn't scream, it's like it says in their requirements this application, and I mean in some cases it makes sense because you would have some applications that actually use SQL logins for user authentication for users. So the admin part of the application would create a SQL login when you create a user, and I don't want to clutter my my instance with all other databases with new logins, basically. So
Yeah.
I'll have to test it basically and see if it flies. But I had another thing. So when I create the container availability group, SQL Server will copy all the sysadmin logins, including, of course, the SA, and they will get the same SID as they have on the main instance.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really help if I would, change the password for the SA login. If I know the password for SA inside the container availability group, then I'm SA in the external instance as well if I want to. So disabling SA becomes even more important.
That's an interesting edge case. Yeah.
Yeah. So
it's interesting.
But on the other hand, it's not. It sounds to me like a best practice to just not have an SA account inside the container availability group. Because why would you want to connect as SA to a container availability group?
Because you want to maintain it. Because you want to create stuff at the instance level, like as at the container availability group level, such as jobs, operators, configure linked servers, maybe. There's all kind of stuff that you must have sysadmin in order to do.
Yes, but then I would use my own sysadmin account. I wouldn't use SA.
Well, that's a different issue. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's given that it's not the perfect solution for isolation. I can't give a developer a container availability group and just say you're sysadmin and this, do whatever you want, because they may be able to escalate that sysadmin privilege to the external.
Well, it depends. It depends if you also grant the same SID permissions at the external instance or not.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and then if you don't, then I don't think you will have a way of going outside unless he knows the SID of sysadmins outside of the availability group. But that is really stretching it.
Yeah. It's I haven't played with it at all. I played with other features from the CTPs, like the managed instance link, for example, and the T-SQL additions, but I haven't played with container availability groups at all. So it's time to do it, I guess.
Yeah, it's nice. But it does have its limitations, understandably. And it doesn't solve, obviously, every problem related to availability groups. But for the simple use cases, I think it's really, it works really well.
Yeah, and I really like it's nice that they finally have the solution to be able to fail over jobs. Because SQL agent jobs are parts of applications everywhere. It's not just an administration thing. You have all kinds of systems that schedule, system maintenance for application maintenance with agent jobs. So it's nice to be able to do it. It was possible, but you had to use some force on the jobs to make them look for if they are in the right replica or not. So
yeah, there are all kinds of possible solutions. It's relevant, for example, for logins. If you want to make sure you have the same logins with the same SID on both of the replicas, that is also an issue. Yeah. And linked servers as well, if you have a dependency of those. So it does provide, obviously, very good solutions, but not for every edge case. On the screen, I have links to a few very useful resources in regards to container availability groups. There's a chapter in Microsoft. Oh, I need to change that. They changed it to Microsoft Learn instead of Microsoft Docs. No worries, it still works. So yes, so they have a whole chapter about it. it's also featured in the What's New in SQL Server 2022 list. You can also see other features there. Bob Ward from Microsoft, he has a folder in the Microsoft repository on GitHub with all kinds of useful demo and sample scripts for container availability groups. It's very useful. It's very fun to play around with. That's an excellent place to start if you want to play around with container availability groups.
Mm.
And as I said before, if you have a bit more complicated use cases for failing over jobs, then you can still use the solution developed by us, Handle My Jobs. And it's obviously relevant for SQL Server versions which are prior to 2022, because container availability groups is the 2022 only feature as of now, and it's not even GA yet. So obviously there will still be a need for it for a long while.
Yeah, I'm still trying to convince some clients to upgrade from SQL 2008. So
yeah, I know the feel, man.
I posted in the chat also the recording of your Header My Job presentation that you made on SQL Friday. So I found it in the YouTube channels.
Cool.
My wife just texted me and asked lunch. So
I think it's a good time for lunch. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, Magnus.
Thanks for coming.